It happened on a Wednesday. I didn't expect it. In fact, I never saw it coming, not in 1,000 years. It was the kind of day that seemed like any other. The sun creeping through the blinds, a cup of coffee that I'd let get cold while scrolling through my phone. Everything felt ordinary, but life has a way of slapping you awake when you least expect it. I remember exactly where I was, sitting on the worn-out couch in our shared apartment, the one Emma and I had called home for the last 3 years. We had been best friends for so long that our connection felt effortless, like breathing. She was in the kitchen, laughing over something stupid on her phone, the sound of her voice always pulling me in, a melody I'd become addicted to. But that day, everything was different. The moment the doorbell rang, my heart did something I couldn't quite explain. Emma stood frozen, her face drained of color when she opened it. There was a man in a uniform standing in front of her, holding something I didn't yet understand. My body tensed, my breath caught, but I didn't know why. Then the words fell from the man's lips like a blow to the chest. "I'm sorry to inform you, ma'am, but your brother, he's been in an accident." The words sliced through the air with such finality, such coldness, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Emma's eyes went wide, and in an instant she crumpled into a heap on the floor. I was on autopilot, rushing to her side, trying to catch my breath and hold it together for her. She trembled beneath my touch, and I felt a swell of something deep within me, a protectiveness, a need to shield her from the storm that was just beginning. But I couldn't shield her from this. Her world had shattered in a heartbeat. Her brother, the one she loved more than anything, was lying in some hospital bed, fighting for his life. As I helped Emma stand, my mind raced. It was a nightmarish blur. What happened next I never could have predicted. We drove to the hospital, silence thick in the car, neither of us knowing what to say, both of us swallowed by grief. And then there it was, the turning point. Emma looked at me, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "What if I lose him, Anna? What if I lose everything?" I didn't know how to answer, but I felt something stir inside me, something far beyond friendship, something that had been quietly waiting in the shadows of my heart for years. We sat in that sterile, lifeless hospital waiting room for what felt like an eternity. Time had become irrelevant, each second stretched out, dragging with it the weight of our unspoken thoughts. Emma was silent now, the tears still streaking down her face, but her gaze had gone distant, lost somewhere beyond the sterile white walls, somewhere she couldn't reach. I didn't know what to say. I had never seen her like this before. Strong, independent Emma, my best friend, the person I had shared everything with, was broken in a way I couldn't fix. I wanted to tell her everything would be okay, but I didn't believe it myself. I didn't know how to promise her that. But then, as if the universe was playing a cruel trick, the door to the ICU opened. A doctor stepped through, his face unreadable, and for a second it felt like my heart stopped altogether. He looked at Emma, and in that moment I realized that no matter how much I wanted to protect her, I couldn't stop this. I couldn't fix what was broken. "He's stable for now," the doctor said, but those words felt like they meant nothing in the face of Emma's despair. She nodded, but I could see the fear clawing at her from inside. I reached out to hold her hand, and that's when it happened. As I touched her, the warmth of her skin against mine sent an electric shock straight through me. It was a feeling I hadn't allowed myself to recognize until now, a pull that felt so undeniable it was as if everything in me had just clicked into place. My heart pounded in my chest as she squeezed my hand back, her fingers trembling slightly. We were both holding on, but it wasn't just out of grief. It was something more, something raw, something I had hidden away for years. I tried to shake the thought away, focusing on Emma, on being there for her. But I couldn't ignore the way she looked at me, through the veil of her tears, with a vulnerability that only came from the deepest parts of her soul. It was then that I realized something I had never allowed myself to fully understand. I wasn't just her best friend. I had never been just her best friend. I had been something more, something deeper, for longer than either of us had ever acknowledged. And the pain in her eyes wasn't the only thing pulling at me. Suddenly, everything that had been unspoken between us, the late-night talks, the lingering glances, the quiet moments we shared, came crashing down on me. My heart began to race, and I wondered, had Emma felt it too? Had she always felt it? I wanted to ask, wanted to know, but the words got stuck in my throat. The moment was too fragile, too delicate. And just as I was about to say something, anything, a phone rang, breaking the silence. It was her brother's name flashing on the screen. We both froze. Emma's hand tightened around mine, her breath hitching. It wasn't him. It wasn't his voice on the other end. It was his wife, telling us that the doctors had warned them too, that there was only so much time left. In that instant, something in me snapped. We both knew the truth now. It wasn't just about the fear of losing him. It was the realization that this moment, this shared pain, had opened a door between us that could never be closed again. And as I looked at her, my best friend, with all her pain and vulnerability laid bare, I knew I had to make a choice. Stay in the safety of our friendship, or take a leap into the unknown, where the lines between love and friendship blurred into something far more terrifying and far more beautiful. The days that followed were a whirlwind of hospital visits, sterile smells, and the haunting sound of machines beeping in the background. Her brother's condition fluctuated, sometimes improving, sometimes deteriorating, and with every update the emotional toll weighed heavier. Emma was holding on by a thread, but beneath her fragile composure I could see the cracks. The walls she'd built up, the ones that had always protected her, were starting to crumble. In those moments, I didn't know what she needed more, my strength or my silence. And yet, through it all, the undeniable pull between us never wavered. One evening, as we sat together in the hospital's dimly lit lounge, I watched her run her hands through her hair, frustration etched across her face. I had been there every step of the way, but even now, as she looked at me, she seemed so far away. And in that moment, it was as if everything we'd shared over the years collided. Every laugh, every tear, every second spent together, into a single, overwhelming wave of emotion. Emma turned to me suddenly, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and something deeper, something I couldn't quite place. "Why are you still here, Anna?" Her voice was raw, the vulnerability in it shaking me to my core. "You don't have to stay. I've been horrible to you lately. You don't deserve this. You deserve someone who can actually be there for you, someone who's not always so broken." The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but also the guilt, the heavy burden she'd been carrying for so long. But what she didn't understand was that I wasn't leaving her, not for any reason. And I didn't want her to apologize for this. Not when, in truth, I had always been right here. I tried to speak, but my throat tightened. There was so much I needed to say, but none of the words felt right. Instead, I simply reached for her hand, the action feeling like it might be the most natural thing I'd ever done. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into me, her head resting on my shoulder, her breath shaky. I could feel the weight of her exhaustion in every tiny movement, but beneath that, there was something more. Something unspoken but clear. She wasn't just leaning on me out of necessity. Her hand gently brushed against mine, and it was like a spark ignited between us. Something shifted, something I couldn't ignore any longer. The years of friendship, the moments we'd shared, everything built up to this. I wanted to kiss her. I wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, that we would get through this together. But I didn't know if we could, because there was no going back after that. The moment we crossed that line, everything would change. The walls between us would be gone forever, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing her, of losing what we had, no matter how much I wanted to have her in a way I never had before. I leaned back, my heart hammering in my chest, and tried to swallow the lump in my throat. "Emma," I whispered, barely able to speak, "I've always been here for you, and I always will be. But don't push me away because of something you think you might lose. I'm not going anywhere." I waited for her to pull back, for her to tell me she needed space or that she wasn't ready. But instead, she looked up at me with those wide, haunted eyes, and in that moment, I knew she felt it too. Whatever this was, whatever had always been there, was bigger than the fear, the uncertainty, and the pain we were both trying to hold at bay. It was bigger than friendship, and the question was no longer whether we could keep pretending. The question was, were we brave enough to face what was pulling us together? But before either of us could speak again, the hospital intercom buzzed, announcing an emergency. Emma stiffened, and I knew in that instant that we had no time to think. Life had a way of pushing us forward, even when we weren't ready to make a choice. The emergency was a cruel twist of fate, a reminder that life doesn't wait for us to find the right moment. We rushed back to the ICU, the sterile corridors feeling colder than ever. My hand was still entwined with hers, and though I couldn't see her face, I could feel her trembling beside me. Her brother's condition had taken a sharp turn for the worse. The doctors spoke in hushed tones, faces grim, but I couldn't focus on their words. My entire world had narrowed down to just one thing: Emma. In this hospital, amidst the beeping machines and the sterile white walls, nothing else mattered. The future, the past, the uncertainty of our lives, it all faded into the background as we stood there, waiting for an answer we knew was coming but refused to acknowledge. As the hours dragged on, I realized something. We hadn't talked about it, not really. We hadn't even acknowledged what had been hanging in the air between us for days. Maybe it was because neither of us knew how to put words to it, or maybe we were both afraid of what that conversation would mean. But something had shifted between us. This wasn't just grief. This wasn't just fear of losing someone we loved. It was deeper. The way we held on to each other, the way our bodies instinctively leaned into one another, it wasn't just friendship anymore. I was sure of it now, and I knew deep down that Emma had always known. The only question was whether we were both willing to take the leap together. I caught her gaze just as a nurse passed us, and for the briefest moment the world seemed to stand still. Her eyes, red from crying, locked onto mine with a look I had never seen before, desperate, raw, and so full of longing it nearly knocked the breath out of me. There was no more pretending, no more hiding. The years of friendship, the shared moments, the quiet affection we'd both swept under the rug for so long, it was all out in the open now. The question lingered between us like the sharp edge of a blade. What now? "I don't know if I can do this, Anna," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the sterile hum of the hospital. She wasn't talking about her brother anymore. She was talking about us, about this fragile, terrifying thing that had slowly bloomed between us. And I knew in that moment she was more afraid of what we might lose than of what we might find. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. The fear of what might happen if we crossed that line, the fear of ruining everything still weighed on me. But it was nothing compared to the fear of never knowing what could be between us. "I don't know either," I whispered back, my voice trembling. "But I know I can't walk away from this." "Not from you." Her eyes welled with tears, and before I could stop myself, I reached out, cupping her face in my hands. There were no more words to say. I pulled her close, feeling the softness of her skin against mine, the heat of her body mixing with mine. The world around us disappeared, and for the first time in days, I could breathe. And then it happened. Her lips met mine in a kiss that was both a question and an answer all at once. There was no hesitation, no doubt. It was everything we had both been too afraid to admit, too afraid to act on. In that single kiss, I felt everything we had hidden from each other for years: the longing, the love, the hope for something more. And just as quickly as it began, reality came crashing back, but this time it didn't feel like something we had to run from. The kiss ended, but Emma's hand remained in mine, and for the first time I felt like we weren't just surviving this together. We were living it. We had taken the leap. And it was worth it. We didn't speak much after that kiss. There was no need for words. What had passed between us was undeniable, unspoken, yet understood in every quiet glance, every gentle touch. It was as if the world around us had finally clicked into place. Her brother fought on, and we were right there beside him, but now there was something else, something entirely new blossoming between us, something we could no longer ignore, no matter how much the world around us demanded our attention. The days in the hospital became a blur, but the silence between Emma and me felt filled with a kind of peace. For the first time in ages, we didn't need to say what we were feeling. Our bodies and our eyes did all the talking. Eventually, her brother began to improve. His progress was slow, fragile, but it was progress. The tension that had hung so heavily in the air started to lift, and with it, the weight I hadn't realized I was carrying began to ease. But even with that, even with the relief that began to settle into our lives, the changes between Emma and me couldn't be undone. I could see it in the way we moved around each other, in the small moments when our eyes met and we both knew what was unspoken between us. One night as we sat on the balcony of our apartment, now quieter, now filled with a different kind of energy, Emma turned to me with a question in her eyes. Her face was still soft from the relief of her brother's recovery, but there was a depth in her gaze that hadn't been there before. "Are we really doing this, Anna?" she asked, the vulnerability of the moment hanging between us. There was a hesitation in her voice, but it wasn't fear. It was the uncertainty of diving headfirst into something neither of us had ever expected to be. And yet, in that moment, I knew we both felt the same pull, the same irresistible current that had brought us here. I reached out, taking her hand in mine. It was simple, this touch, but it held more weight than any words could. "We are," I said softly, "and I think we've been doing it all along, just too scared to admit it." She didn't pull away. In fact, she leaned closer, her forehead resting against mine. "I'm scared," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we mess this up? What if we lose everything?" I smiled, pulling her into an embrace. "We won't mess it up," I whispered. "We've been best friends through everything, Emma. This is just the next part of our story, the part we never knew we needed until now." As we sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, I realized something profound. Love isn't always the neat, tidy thing we imagine it to be. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes it's a leap into the unknown. And sometimes it's waiting for the courage to take that leap together. Our journey had begun with uncertainty, with fear, with a bond that felt too deep to unravel. But we had taken that leap. And for the first time in my life, I knew it was worth it. Our friendship had always been the most important thing in my life. But this was a different kind of love, one that didn't erase what we had but expanded it, deepened it in ways I never thought possible. I couldn't promise that it would always be easy, but I could promise that I was willing to fight for it every single day. With Emma by my side, I knew that whatever happened next, we would face it together, and that in itself was the greatest leap of all.